My pleasure to be here with Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn, who is the academic director of the Center for Jewish-Christian Understanding and Cooperation in Israel. Rabbi Korn has written extensively on issues of Jewish ethics and Jewish-Christian understanding and currently lives in Jerusalem. So thank you for taking this time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So where I'd like to begin with, since you think so much about ethics and also the intersection of ethics and Halacha, Jewish law, is what is Torah all about? Meaning, if someone came up and said, what does Torah really want of us? What would you say?
Yes, well, that's a big question, right? And it's an essential question. I think every religious person, every religious Jew has to ask himself or herself this question, because it's very easy to get lost in the minute details of things. But a truly spiritual person really has to ask where we're going. You know, what is this all about? What's the purpose of all of these immediate details? And the Torah really tells us what God wants of us. The very first Jew was instructed by God in Parshat Lech Lecha. God tells Abraham, "V'nivrachu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adamah," that through you and your descendants, the Jewish people, the whole world will be blessed. We're supposed to bring blessing to the whole world. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us exactly what the nature of that blessing is, right? But it's fleshed out later in the Torah, and the rabbis talk about it. Essentially, we're supposed to bring godliness to the world, a sense of awe, a sense of reverence, right? And teach humanity the fundamental principles of ethics. The Torah later says, "Vasita hayashar v'atov b'nei Hashem," you should have to do what is good and what is right in the eyes of God. Abraham, after Parshat Lech Lecha, is instructed to keep the way of the Lord and to do tzedakah u'mishpat, to teach his sons and his daughters and the world to do righteousness and justice. So we should be the carriers, we should be the pace setters, we should be the teachers of justice and righteousness in the world. So the details are very important. God is in the details, but you can't get lost and focus only on the details. You have to understand where the details supposed to take you.
Where do you think the halachic community today has strayed from this big mission? Like in what way philosophically, and in what way lemaisa, practically, do you think we've strayed from this?
I think we have strayed. I think we've lost the sense of ultimate purpose, and I think we've been traumatized. The Jewish people have been traumatized. We're fighting for our own survival in the diaspora, and survival in and of itself became the goal. Right? And there's different ways to survive. You can survive by building walls and just looking inward and taking care of your own, and focusing on the small things that build community and that keep Jews together. And that's really what I think we've kind of been traumatized into that mode. And we were traumatized also by the Enlightenment and the Reformation. Liberal Jews who wanted to leave Torah said ethics is all there is to do. So as a reaction to that, as a counterbalance to that, sometimes Orthodoxy went too far and said, no, ethics are not important. What's important is law. Law, right? And just the individual mitzvot. Don't worry about any kind of universal ethics or dealing with Gentiles. Just stay amongst yourself and focus on law. Now, it's very interesting that's a modern attitude. I don't think that the rabbis of the Talmud had that attitude. Certainly, Abraham didn't have that attitude because, God told him that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham challenges God on ethical grounds. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. He tells God, you can't do this, right? Will the judge of all the earth not act justly? So you can't do this. And the great medieval rabbis also had a keen ethical sense. Maimonides, who was the greatest halachic master in all of our history, he said that if you only observe the din, there's this beautiful passage where he talks about how you should treat Gentile servants. And he says that the law is that you can treat them as harshly as you want to. That's the strict law. But no Jew should do that. Jews should have a sense of compassion, chesed and rachamim, and be kind to even Gentile servants. And he said that if you don't do this, if there's a Jew who's not kind, and doesn't have an ethical sense toward even his Gentile servants, right, then he's acting like an idolater. Mm-hmm. And in the Rambam's lexicon, you can't get lower than that. Right. That's the worst you can be as an idolater. So if you have a Jew who acts, without a sense of kindness and compassion, right, you're basically in the idolatrous community. Mm-hmm. That was Maimonides. And there's a famous phrase that was stated by Nachmanides, Ramban, who said that it's possible to observe all of the Halacha, right, all of the Torah, and still be a naval. A naval is a scoundrel, right? A loathsome individual. It's possible to observe all of the minute details of the Torah and only be legally oriented and still be an ethically loathsome individual. Naval b'shuta Torah, that's the way.
You eat too much meat, even though it's kosher.
That's
you drink too much wine. You want sex all the time. I mean, these things that even though it's permitted, you have no sense of restraint, no sense of conscience.
So the law gives us a certain structure, right? But don't be seduced into thinking that there's only law.
Right. So what happens when there's a clash? Let's say there's a clash between the halacha as it's been codified and the precedents of recent centuries and the most basic ethical understanding that we have today in modernity. What happens when there's a clash?
Yeah. That's a huge challenge for Jews today. Huge challenge because we live in times that are radically different from the past. And because of the focus on law and mitzvah in a narrow sense, sometimes religious Jews or Orthodox Jews are taught that the ethics are not important, right? If there seems to be a clash or a conflict, the only thing that's important is the absolute law here. And it occurs with respect to Gentiles, for instance. Many of the laws with respect to Gentiles were really talking about Gentiles who were idolaters, not the civilized Christians or Muslims or even secular ethical people of today. It occurs with respect to women. Some of the laws in terms of how to treat women, I'll give you an example. Very simple example. Maimonides, again, who's the greatest codifier of Jewish law, the greatest master of all of Jewish law, lived in a Muslim society where men had near absolute control over women. So he says that, and women weren't supposed to be in the public domain. So Maimonides says that a husband should not let his wife out of the house more than twice a month. Now, that's codified law in Maimonides. Right? Maimonides also says, and this is a more practical example, that a woman can't occupy any position of leadership. Now, to us, this certainly the second
physically
that
he also says physically
that if a wife disobeys the husband, he can beat her with a rod. That's what he says. Now, religious Jews are not doing these things today. That's for sure. But but there's a disparity between what the codified law is, at least in Maimonides' eyes, and what we think is correct and ethical today. Where the rubber does meet the road today is this issue of women's leadership. Mm-hmm. Can we treat women? Should women be in the public arena, both the secular arena and the religious arena? Mm-hmm. In Maimonides' eyes, that was absolutely taboo according to the law. Mm-hmm. So, do we follow Maimonides' precedent, or can we and should we have a more egalitarian ethos and begin to allow women to do this as a full expression of their religiosity, of their divinity, of their autonomy? There is a real disparity and a tension between the tradition and the halacha and modern ethos. Now, I want to use a term that's a little stronger than ethos because I think it's ethics. I think many of us, and rightly so, and I'm included in this, view it as a violation of justice to treat women as second-class citizens or to be subordinate to a man. That simply doesn't fly. And most of the religious community, by the way, kind of accepts this. We have no problem with women Supreme Court justices. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right? In Israel, just 3 months ago, a religious woman who covers her hair and dresses in a very modest way, a religious woman was elevated to the Supreme Court.
In Brooklyn also, there's a Hasidic woman who's just
that's
got
right.
into it. Yeah.
That's right. So we accepted in the secular positions, but what about in terms of religious life? It's a little harder. I think we're going a little slower in terms of allowing women to become rabbis and teachers of Torah and models and decisors and halachic decisors. So the real question is, where are we? What do we do in this instance of tension? We want to be faithful to the tradition, we want to be faithful to the halacha, and yet there's a very compelling ethical case in terms of treating women equally, in terms of understanding everyone's individuality and giving every individual the maximum opportunity to express themselves and to teach and to exercise a sort of spiritual influence on other people.
So some would respond saying, no, but the halacha demands that we submit our conscience, we turn off this secular ethics in order that we submit to the law. What do you mean? Ethics can never trump the precedent. What would your response be
if
to
God
that?
comes to you at night and says, take your son up to the mountain and sacrifice your son, if that's the word of God to you, should you do it? Should you do it? I mean, Abraham and the Akedah is the kind of the paradigm case in that regard. Certainly in Christian literature, not so much in Jewish literature, but in Christian literature, there was this debate that if you have a conflict of ethics and divine command, you ignore the ethics and you obey the divine command. There's a teleological suspension of the ethical. That's the way Soren Kierkegaard phrased it. We don't see that strain in Jewish rabbinic thinking, but what do you do? When the rubber meets the road, what do you really do? I think everybody, has to decide himself or herself. Certainly every rabbi has to decide how to deal with these issues. My personal approach is that, to me, the greatest voice of God sometimes is the still small voice of the individual conscience. Mm-hmm. And I would never ask anybody, as a rabbi, I would never ask anybody to violate his or her conscience about what he or she thinks is right. But if you follow your conscience and it seems to be in disparity to what the accepted halacha is, then you can't end there. Then I think you have to continue to struggle and continue to understand the Torah and the writings of the rabbis until you get to a point in which your understanding of Torah is consistent with your conscience. And that's not easy to do. Mm-hmm. It's really not easy to do. So the important thing in the spiritual life, I think, is the struggle. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. In terms of the ethical life, the important thing is how you treat other people, right? The action, the behavior. But if you want to have a deeply spiritual life, then you have to continue to struggle. Yeah. And there's always these disparities. And you have to have a lot of courage, because frankly, it's very easy to go along with the crowd. Right. It's very easy just to follow the masses and not make enemies and not disagree with great rabbis. Right. But the spiritual person has to follow his or her conscience. Right,
as Rav Kook said, your Yirat Shamayim is at risk. Your awe of the heavens is at risk if you silence his conscience in the name of submission. So my last question for you is, where do we see this kind of failure to lose this big picture playing out in Israeli Orthodoxy? Where in Israeli Orthodoxy do we primarily see the lack of this ethical consciousness being fostered, and what's at risk with that?
I think
even in war ethics, for example.
Yeah, so war ethics. Now it's interesting. The Jewish people never had to engage in discussions of ethics of war for the last 2,000 years because we weren't involved in wars as a people. The Catholic community, the Catholic tradition, had to struggle with this. So there's a very rich, robust literature of Catholic just war theory. We are just now beginning to do this. And that, this absence of precedent, combined with this notion that everything is about halacha, sometimes makes us a little deaf to issues. And it's a critical issue in Israel, because it's not talk in the Beit Midrash, right? It's what's actually happening in the field. Lives are at stake. Jewish lives, Arab lives are at stake, and how we can. And I'm very proud of the fact that I think the Israeli army has a code of ethics that's second to none in the world. It's not always obeyed, in the fog of war and the immediacy of making a snap decision. Sometimes Israeli soldiers make the wrong decisions, but there's a code of ethics that I think we have a lot to be proud of. and that I think is second to none.
Yeah.
Including the American Army. I know of cases, we don't have enough time to talk about specific cases where the American Army has come to ethicists, Israeli ethicists, and say, how do you guys do this? Because we wind up killing more civilians than the Israelis kill. Teach us how to spare civilian lives. Right. Now, sometimes religious people are a bit deaf to this ethic, and that's a great tragedy. Because of the impulse, A, of only looking at halacha, and B, I think there's a certain community in the national religious camp in Israel for whom the enemy is not considered to be a sacred human being with Tzelem Elokim, and the main thing is victory and conquering the land. And sometimes the cost for that is a lack of sensitivity toward enemy civilians. So we have a lot to learn. And it is an interesting paradox, particularly in Israel. It's the army. It's the secular army. It's the secular officers in the army, who are instilling the ethical drive and the ethical values in the society. So let us not be misled by who are really religious and who sometimes religious people who observe outward ritual and dress with religious garb sometimes don't act religiously, and sometimes Rav Kook loved to talk about this. Sometimes it's the bareheaded Jews who are leading the ethical and the spiritual impulse at a certain historical moment.
Beautiful. So we hope our listeners tonight, our Jewish listeners, will continue to see the beauty and the ethical depth within halacha, to cultivate our ethical consciousness, and also be courageous to understand that we do have a broader purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. And we're responsible. We're ultimately responsible for these choices and for keeping halacha ethically relevant and putting it back onto the front lines of the global scene to bring the message of Avram Avinu back.
Right. I would say at the end of the day, that we can be as ritually religious as we want, and that may be good for our own souls. But that impresses no one other than ourselves. Right. If you really want to make a mark, you have to be a mamlechet kohanim. You have to kind of influence. You have to be a model, right, of ethical seriousness and ethical integrity, and that's what really influences people deeply. Not how much kosher you eat, or how long your tzitzis are, or how long you daven. It's how you interact on an ethical principle level with the people around you and the society around you.
Check out the writings on Jewish ethics by Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn. Thank you so much.
Thank you.